In the 19th century most historians regarded Russia as part of Europe, but it is now becoming increasingly clear that Russia is another civilization quite separate from Western civilization. Both of these civilizations are descended from classical civilization, but the connection with this predecessor was made so differently that two quite different traditions came into existence. Russian traditions were derived from Byzantium directly. Western traditions were derived from the more moderate classical civilization indirectly. Having passed through the Dark Ages when there was no state or government in the West, Russian civilization was created from three sources originally: 1. The Slav people, 2. Viking invaders from the north, and 3. The Byzantine tradition from the south. These three were fused together as the result of a common experience arising from Russia's exposed geographical position on the western edge of a great flatland stretching for thousands of miles to the east. This flatland is divided horizontally into three zones, of which the most southern is open plain, while the most northern is open bush and tundra. The middle zone is forest. The southern zone or steppes consists of two parts. The southern is a salty plain which is practically useless, while the northern part, next to the forest, is the famous Black Earth region of rich agricultural soil. Unfortunately, the eastern portion of this great Eurasian plain has been getting steadily drier for thousands of years, with the consequence that the Ural-Altaic-speaking peoples of Central and East Central Asia, peoples like the Huns, Bulgars, Magyars, Mongols, and Turks, have pushed westward repeatedly along the steppe corridor between the Urals and the Caspian Sea, making the Black Earth steppes dangerous for sedentary agricultural peoples. The Slavs first appeared more than 2,000 years ago as a peaceful, evasive people, with an economy based on hunting and rudimentary agriculture, in the forests of eastern Poland. These people slowly increased in numbers, moving northeastward through the forests, mixing with the scattered Finnish hunting people who were there already. About AD 700 or so, the Northmen, whom we know as Vikings, came down from the Baltic Sea, by way of the rivers of Eastern Europe, and eventually reached the Black Sea and attacked Constantinople. These Northmen were trying to make a way of life out of militarism, seizing booty and slaves, imposing tribute on conquered peoples, collecting furs, honey, and wax from the timid Slavs lurking in their forests, and exchanging these for the colorful products of the Byzantine south. In time the Northmen set up fortified trading posts along their river highways, notably at Novgorod in the north, at Smolensk in the center, and at Kiev in the south. They married Slav women and imposed on the rudimentary agricultural hunting economy of the Slavs a superstructure of a tribute-collecting state with an exploitative, militaristic, commercial economy. This created the pattern of a two-class Russian society which has continued ever since, much intensified by subsequent historical events. In time the ruling class of Russia became acquainted with Byzantine culture. They were dazzled by it, and sought to import it into their wilderness domains in the north. In this way they impose on the Slav peoples many of the accessories of the Byzantine Empire, such as Orthodox Christianity, the Byzantine alphabet, the Byzantine calendar, the use of domed ecclesiastical architecture, the name Tsar Caesar for their ruler, and innumerable other traits. Most important of all, they imported the Byzantine totalitarian autocracy, under which all aspects of life, including political, economic, intellectual, and religious, were regarded as departments of government, under the control of an autocratic ruler. These beliefs were part of the Greek tradition, and were based ultimately on Greek inability to distinguish between state and society. Since society includes all human activities, the Greeks had assumed that the state must include all human activities. In the days of classical Greece, this all-inclusive entity was called the polis, the term which meant both society and state. In the later Roman period, this all-inclusive entity was called the imperium. The only difference was that the polis was sometimes, as in Pericles' Athens about 450 BC, democratic, while the imperium was always a military autocracy. Both were totalitarian, so that religion and economic life were regarded as spheres of governmental activity. This totalitarian autocratic tradition was carried on to the Byzantine Empire and passed from it to the Russian state in the north and to the later Ottoman Empire in the south. In the north, this Byzantine tradition combined with the experience of the north meant to intensify the two-class structure of Slav society. In the new Slav or Orthodox civilization, this fusion, fitting together the Byzantine tradition and the Viking tradition, created Russia. From Byzantium came autocracy and the idea of the state as an absolute power and as a totalitarian power, as well as such important applications of these principles as the idea that the state should control thought and religion, that the church should be a branch of the government, that law is an enactment of the state, and that the ruler is semi-divine. From the Vikings came the idea that the state is a foreign importation, based on militarism and supported by booty and tribute, that economic innovations are the function of the government, that power rather than law is the basis of social life, and that society, with its people and its property, is the private property of a foreign ruler. These concepts of the Russian system must be emphasized because they are so foreign to our own traditions. In the West, the Roman Empire, which continued in the East as the Byzantine Empire, disappeared in 476, and although many efforts were made to revive it, there was clearly a period, about Gu, when there was no empire, no state, and no public authority in the West. The state disappeared, yet society continued. So also, religious and economic life continued. This clearly showed that the state and society were not the same thing, that society was the basic entity, and that the state was a crowning, but not essential, cap to the social structure. This experience had revolutionary effects. It was discovered that man can live without a state. This became the basis of Western liberalism. It was discovered that the state, if it exists, must serve men, and that it is incorrect to believe that the purpose of men is to serve the state. It was discovered that economic life, religious life, law, and private property can all exist and function effectively without a state. From this emerged laissez-faire, separation of church and state, rule of law, and the sanctity of private property. In Rome, in Byzantium, and in Russia, law was regarded as an enactment of a supreme power. In the West, when no supreme power existed, it was discovered that law still existed as the body of rules which governed social life. Thus law was found by observation in the West, not enacted by autocracy as in the East. This meant that authority was established by law and under the law in the West, while authority was established by power and above the law in the East. The West felt that the rules of economic life were found and not enacted, that individuals had rights independent of, and even opposed to, public authority, that groups could exist, as the Church existed, by right and not by privilege, and without the need to have any charter of incorporation entitling them to exist as a group or act as a group, that groups or individuals could own property as a right and not as a privilege, and that such property could not be taken by force but must be taken by established process of law. It was emphasized in the West that the way a thing was done was more important than what was done, while in the East what was done was far more significant than the way in which it was done. There was also another basic distinction between Western civilization and Russian civilization. This was derived from the history of Christianity. This new faith came into classical civilization from Semitic society. In its origin it was of this worldly religion, believing that the world and the flesh were basically good, or at least filled with good potentialities, because both were made by God. The body was made in the image of God. God became man in this world with a human body, to save men as individuals, and to establish peace on earth. The early Christians intensified this worldly tradition, insisting that salvation was possible only because God lived and died in a human body in this world, that the individual could be saved only through God's help, grace, and by living correctly in this body on this earth, good works that there would be, someday, the millennium on this earth, and that, at that last judgment, there would be a resurrection of the body and life everlasting. In this way the world of space and time, which God had made at the beginning with the statement, "It was good," book of Genesis, would, at the end, be restored to its original condition. This optimistic, this worldly religion was taken into classical civilization at a time when the philosophic outlook of that society was quite incompatible with the religious outlook of Christianity. The classical philosophic outlook, which we might call Neoplatonic, was derived from the teachings of Persian Zoroastrianism, Pythagorean rationalism, and Platonism. It was dualistic, dividing the universe into two opposed worlds, the world of matter and flesh and the world of spirit and ideas. The former world was changeable, unknowable, illusionary, and evil. The latter world was eternal, knowable, real, and good. Truth, to these people, could be found by the use of reason and logic alone, not high use of the body or the senses, since these were prone to error, and must be spurned. The body, as Plato said, was the tomb of the soul. Thus the classical world into which Christianity came about AD 60 believed that the world and the body were unreal, unknowable, corrupt, and hopeless, and that no truth or success could be found by the use of the body, the senses, or matter. A small minority, derived from Democritus and the early Ionian scientists through Aristotle, Epicurus, and Lucretius, rejected the Platonic dualism, preferring materialism as an explanation of reality. These materialists were equally incompatible with the new Christian religion. Moreover, even the ordinary citizen of Rome had an outlook whose implications were not compatible with the Christian religion. To give one simple example, while the Christians spoke of a millennium in the future, the average Roman continued to think of a golden age in the past, just as Homer had. As a consequence of the fact that Christian religion came into a society with an incompatible philosophic outlook, the Christian religion was ravaged by theological and dogmatic disputes and shot through with other worldly heresies. In general, these heresies felt that God was so perfect and so remote and man was so imperfect and such a worm that the gap between God and man could not be bridged by any act of man, that salvation depended on grace rather than on good works, and that, if God ever did so lower himself as to occupy the human body, this was not an ordinary body, and that, accordingly, Christ could be either true God or true man but could not be both. This point of view was opposed by the Christian fathers of the Church, not always successfully, but in the decisive battle, at the First Church Council, held at Nicaea in 325. The Christian point of view was enacted into the formal dogma of the Church. Although the Church continued to exist for centuries thereafter in a society whose philosophic outlook was ill-adapted to the Christian religion, and obtained a compatible philosophy only in the medieval period, the basic outlook of Christianity reinforced the experience of the Dark Ages to create the outlook of Western civilization. Some of the elements of this outlook which were of great importance were the following. 1. The importance of the individual, since he alone is saved. 2. The potential goodness of the material world and of the body. 3. The need to seek salvation by use of the body and the senses in this world. Good works. 4. Faith in the reliability of the senses which contributed much to Western science. 5. Faith in the reality of ideas which contributed much to Western mathematics. 6. Mundane optimism and millennialism which contributed much to faith in the future and the idea of progress. 7. The belief that God and not the devil reigns over this world by a system of established rules which contributed much to the ideas of natural law, natural science, and the rule of law. These ideas, which became part of the tradition of the West, did not become part of the tradition of Russia. The influence of Greek philosophic thought remained strong in the East. the Latin West before GU used a language which was not, at that time, fitted for abstract discussion, and almost all the dogmatic debates which arose from the incompatibility of Greek philosophy and Christian religion were carried on in the Greek language and federal on the Greek philosophic tradition. In the West, the Latin language reflected a quite different tradition, based on the Roman emphasis on administrative procedures and ethical ideas about human behavior to one's fellow man. As a result, the Greek philosophic tradition remained strong in the East, continued to permeate the Greek-speaking church, and went with that church into the Slavic North. The schism between the Latin Church and the Greek Church strengthened their different points of view, the former being more this-worldly, more concerned with human behavior, and continuing to believe in the efficacy of good works, while the latter was more otherworldly, more concerned with God's majesty and power, and emphasized the evilness and weakness of the body and the world and the efficacy of God's grace. As a result, the religious outlook and, accordingly, the world outlook of Slav religion and philosophy developed in quite a different direction from that in the West. The body, this world, pain, personal comfort, and even death were of little importance. Man could do little to change his lot, which was determined by forces more powerful than he. Resignation to fate, pessimism, and a belief in the overwhelming power of sin and of the devil dominated the East. To this point we have seen the Slavs formed into Russian civilization as the result of several factors. Before we go on, we should, perhaps, recapitulate. The Slavs were subjected at first to the Viking exploitative system. These Vikings copied Byzantine culture, and did it very consciously, in their religion, in their writing, in their state, in their laws, in art, architecture, philosophy, and literature. These rulers were outsiders who invaded all the political, religious, economic, and intellectual life of the new civilization. There was no state, foreigners brought one in. There was no organized religion, one was imported from Byzantium and imposed on the Slavs. The Slav economic life was on a low level, the forest subsistence economy with hunting and rudimentary agriculture. On this the Vikings imposed an international trading system. There was no religious philosophic outlook. The new state church superstructure imposed on the Slavs an outlook derived from Greek dualistic idealism. And, finally, the East never experienced a Dark Ages to show it that society is distinct from the state and more fundamental than the state. This summary brings Russian society down to about 1200. In the next 600 years new experiences merely intensified the Russian development. These experiences arose from the fact that the new Russian society found itself caught between the population pressures of the raiders from the steppes to the east and the pressure of the advancing technology of Western civilization. The pressure of the Ural-Altaic speakers from the eastern steppes culminated in the Mongol-Tatar invasions after 1200. The Mongols conquered Russia and established a tribute-gathering system which continued for generations. Thus there continued to be a foreign exploiting system imposed over the Slav people. In time the Mongols made the princes of Moscow their chief tribute collectors for most of Russia. A little later the Mongols made a court of highest appeal in Moscow, so that both money and judicial cases flowed to Moscow. These continued to flow even after the princes of Moscow 1380 led the successful revolt which ejected the Mongols. As the population pressure from the east decreased, the technological pressure from the west increased after 1500. By Western technology we mean such things as gunpowder and firearms, better agriculture, accounting and public finance, sanitation, printing, and the spread of education. Russia did not get the full impact of these pressures until late, and then from secondary sources, such as Sweden and Poland, rather than from England or France. However, Russia was hammered out between the pressures from the east and those from the west. The result of this hammering was the Russian autocracy, the military tribute-gathering machine superimposed on the Slav population. The poverty of this population made it impossible for them to get firearms or any other advantages of Western technology. Only the state had these things, but the state could afford them only by draining wealth from the people. This draining of wealth from below upward provided arms and Western technology for the rulers but kept the rule too poor to obtain these things, so that all power was concentrated at the top. The continued pressure from the West made it impossible for the rulers to use the wealth that accumulated in their hands to finance economic improvements which might have raised the standards of living of the ruled, since this accumulation had to be used to increase Russian power rather than Russian wealth. As a consequence, pressure downward increased and the autocracy became more autocratic. In order to get a bureaucracy for the army and for government service, the landlords were given personal powers over the peasants, creating a system of serfdom in the East just at the time that medieval serfdom was disappearing in the West. Private property, personal freedom, and direct contact with the state for taxation or for justice were lost to the Russian serfs. The landlords were given these powers so that the landlords would be free to fight and willing to fight for Moscow or to serve in Moscow's autocracy. By 1730 the direct pressure of the West upon Russia began to weaken somewhat because of the decline of Sweden, of Poland, and of Turkey, while Russia was too occupied with Austria and with France to press very forcibly on Russia. Thus, the Slavs, using an adopted Western technology of a rudimentary character, were able to impose their supremacy on the peoples to the east. The peasants of Russia, seeking to escape from the pressures of serfdom in the area west of the Urals, began to flee eastward, and eventually reached the Pacific. The Russian state made every effort to stop this movement because it felt that the peasants must remain to work the land and pay taxes if the landlords were to be able to maintain the military autocracy which was considered necessary. Eventually the autocracy followed the peasants eastward, and Russian society came to occupy the whole of northern Asia. As the pressure from the east and the pressure from the west declined, The autocracy, inspired perhaps by powerful religious feelings, began to have a bad conscience toward its own people. At the same time it still sought to westernize itself. It became increasingly clear that this process of westernization could not be restricted to the autocracy itself, but must be extended downward to include the Russian people. The autocracy found, in 1812, that it could not defeat Napoleon's army without calling on the Russian people. Its inability to defeat the Western Allies in the Crimean War of 1854 to 1856, and the growing threat of the Central Powers after the Austro-German alliance of 1879, made it clear that Russia must be westernized, in technology if not in ideology, throughout all classes of the society, in order to survive. This meant, very specifically, that Russia had to obtain the agricultural revolution and industrialism, but these in turn required that ability to read and write be extended to the peasants and that the rural population be reduced and the urban population be increased. These needs, again, meant that serfdom had to be abolished and that modern sanitation had to be introduced. Thus one need led to another, so that the whole society had to be reformed. In typically Russian fashion all these things were undertaken by government action, but as one reform led to another it became a question whether the autocracy and the landed upper classes would be willing to allow the reform movement to go so far as to jeopardize their power and privileges. For example, the abolition of serfdom made it necessary for the landed nobility to cease to regard the peasants as private property whose only contact with the state was through themselves. Similarly, industrialism and urbanism would create new social classes of bourgeoisie and workers. These new classes inevitably would make political and social demands very distasteful to the autocracy and the landed nobility. If the reforms led to demands for nationalism, how could a dynastic monarchy such as the Romanov autocracy yield to such demands without risking the loss of Finland, Poland, the Ukraine, or Armenia? As long as the desire to westernize and the bad conscience of the upper classes worked together, reform advanced. But as soon as the lower classes began to make demands, reaction appeared. On this basis the history of Russia was an alternation of reform and reaction from the 18th century to the Revolution of 1917. Peter the Great 1689, 1725 and Catherine the Great 1762 to 1796 were supporters of westernization and reform. Paul I 1796 to 1801 was a reactionary. Alexander I 1801 to 1825 and Alexander I 1855 to 1881 were reformers, while Nicholas I 1825 to 1855 and Alexander I 1881, 1894 were reactionaries. As a consequence of these various activities, by 864 serfdom had been abolished, and a fairly modern system of law, of justice, and of education had been established. Local government had been somewhat modernized, a fairly good financial and fiscal system had been established, and an army based on universal military service but lacking in equipment had been created. On the other hand, the autocracy continued, with full power in the hands of weak men, subject to all kinds of personal intrigues of the basest kind. The freed serfs had no adequate lands. The newly literate were subject to a ruthless censorship which tried to control their reading, writing, and thinking. The newly freed and newly urbanized were subject to constant police supervision. The non-Russian peoples of the empire were subjected to waves of Russification and pan-slavism. The judicial system and the fiscal system were administered with an arbitrary disregard of all personal rights or equity, and, in general, the autocracy was both tyrannical and weak. The first period of reform in the 19th century, that under Alexander I, resulted from a fusion of two factors: the conscience-stricken gentry and the westernizing autocracy. Alexander himself represented both factors. As a result of his reforms and those of his grandmother, Catherine the Great, even earlier, there appeared in Russia, for the first time, a new educated class which was wider than the gentry, being recruited from sons of Orthodox priests or of state officials including army officers and, in general, from the fringes of the autocracy and the gentry. When the autocracy became reactionary under Nicholas I, this newly educated group, with some support from the conscience-stricken gentry, formed the revolutionary group generally called the intelligentsia. At first this new group was pro-Western, but later it became increasingly anti-Western and Slavophile because of its disillusionment with the West. In general, the Westernizers argued that Russia was merely a backward and barbaric fringe of Western civilization, that it had made no cultural contribution of its own in its past, and that it must pass through the same economic, political, and social developments as the West. The Westernizers wished to speed up these developments. The Slavophiles insisted that Russia was an entirely different civilization from Western civilization and was much superior because it had a profound spirituality as contrasted with Western materialism. It had a deep irrationality in intimate touch with vital forces and simple living virtues in contrast to Western rationality, artificiality, and hypocrisy. It had its own native form of social organization, the peasant village commune, providing a fully satisfying social and emotional life in contrast to Western frustration of atomistic individualism in sordid cities, and that a socialist society could be built in Russia out of the simple self-governing, cooperative peasant commune without any need to pass along the Western route marked by industrialism, bourgeoisie supremacy, or parliamentary democracy. As industrialism grew in the West, in the period 1830 to 1850, the Russian Westernizers like P.Y.G. Adolf (1793–1856) and Alexander Herzen (1812–1870) became increasingly disillusioned with the West, especially with its urban slums, factory system, social disorganization, middle-class money-grubbing and pettiness, its absolutist state, and its advanced weapons. Originally, the Westernizers in Russia had been inspired by French thinkers, while the Slavophiles had been inspired by German thinkers like Schelling and Hegel, so that the shift from Westernizers to Slavophiles marked a shift from French to Germanic teachers. The Slavophiles supported orthodoxy and monarchy, although they were very critical of the existing Orthodox Church and of the existing autocracy. They claimed that the latter was of Germanic importation, and that the former, instead of remaining the native organic growth of Slavic spirituality, had become little more than a tool of autocracy. Instead of supporting these institutions, many Slavophiles went out into the villages to get in touch with pure Slavic spirituality and virtue in the shape of the untutored peasant. These missionaries, called narodniki, were greeted with unconcealed suspicion and distaste by the peasants, because they were city-bred strangers, were educated, and expressed anti-church and anti-governmental ideas. Already disillusioned with the West, the Church, and the government, and now rejected by the peasants, the intelligentsia could find no social group on which to base a reform program. The result was the growth of nihilism and of anarchism. Nihilism was a rejection of all conventions in the name of individualism, both of these concepts understood in a Russian sense. Since man is a man and not an animal because of his individual development and growth in a society made up of conventions, the nihilist rejection of conventions served to destroy man rather than to liberate him as they expected. The destruction of conventions would not raise man to be an angel, but would lower him to be an animal. Moreover, the individual that the nihilists sought to liberate by this destruction of conventions was not what Western culture understands by the word individual. Rather, it was humanity. The nihilists had no respect whatever for the concrete individual or for individual personality. Rather, by destroying all conventions and stripping all persons naked of all conventional distinctions, they hoped to sink everyone, and especially themselves, into the amorphous, indistinguishable mass of humanity. The nihilists were completely atheist, materialist, irrational, doctrinaire, despotic, and violent. They rejected all thought of self so long as humanity suffered. They became atheists because they could not accept a creator who made an evil, incomplete world full of suffering. They rejected all thought, all art, all idealism, all conventions, because these were superficial, unnecessary luxuries and therefore evil. They rejected marriage, because it was conventional bondage on the freedom of love. They rejected private property, because it was a tool of individual oppression. Some even rejected clothing as a corruption of natural innocence. They rejected vice and licentiousness as unnecessary upper-class luxuries. As Nikolai Berdiaev put it, that is, orthodox asceticism turned inside out, and asceticism without grace. At the base of Russian nihilism, when grasped in its purity and depth, lies the orthodox rejection of the world, the acknowledgement of the sinfulness of all riches and luxury, of all creative profusion in art and in thought. Nihilism considers as sinful luxury not only art, metaphysics, and spiritual values, but religion also. Nihilism is a demand for nakedness, for the stripping of oneself of all the trappings of culture, for the annihilation of all historical traditions, for the setting free of the natural man. The intellectual asceticism of nihilism found expression in materialism. Any more subtle philosophy was proclaimed a sin. Not to be a materialist was to be taken as a moral suspect. If you were not a materialist, then you were in favor of the enslavement of man both intellectually and politically. Then Bertie v. Origin of Russian Communism, London, Geoffrey P. Hells, 1948, page 45. This fantastic philosophy is of great significance because it prepared the ground for Bolshevism. Out of the same spiritual sickness which produced nihilism emerged anarchism. To the anarchist, as revealed by the founder of the movement, Mikhail Bakunin (1814–1876), the chief of all enslaving and needless conventionalities was the state. The discovery that the state was not identical with society, a discovery which the West had made 1,000 years earlier than Russia, could have been a liberating discovery to Russia if, like the West, the Russians had been willing to accept both state and society, each in its proper place. But this was quite impossible in the Russian tradition of fanatical totalitarianism. To this tradition the totalitarian state had been found evil and must, accordingly, be completely destroyed, and replaced by the totalitarian society in which the individual could be absorbed. Anarchism was the next step after the disillusionment of the Narodniki and the agitations of the nihilists. The revolutionary intelligentsia, unable to find any social group on which to base a reform program, and convinced of the evil of all conventional establishments and of the latent perfection in the Russian masses, adopted a program of pure political direct action of the simplest kind: assassination. Merely by killing the leaders of states not only in Russia but throughout the world, governments could be eliminated and the masses freed for social cooperation and agrarian socialism. From this background came the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881, of King Humbert of Italy in 1900, of President McKinley in 1901. As well as many anarchist outrages in Russia, Spain, and Italy in the period 1890 to 1910. The failure of governments to disappear in the face of this terrorist agitation, especially in Russia, where the oppression of autocracy increased after 1881, led, little by little, to a fading of the intelligentsia's faith in destructive violence as a constructive action, as well as in the satisfying peasant commune, and in the survival of natural innocence in the unthinking masses. Just at this point, about 1890, a great change began in Russia. Western industrialism began to grow under governmental and foreign auspices. An urban proletariat began to appear, and Marxist social theory came in from Germany. The growth of industrialism settled the violent academic dispute between Westerners and Slavophiles as to whether Russia must follow the path of Western development or could escape it by falling back on some native Slavic solutions hidden in the peasant commune. The growth of a proletariat gave the revolutionaries once again a social group on which to build, and Marxist theory gave the intelligentsia an ideology which they could fanatically embrace. These new developments, by lifting Russia from the impasse it had reached in 1885, were generally welcomed. Even the autocracy lifted the censorship to allow Marxist theory to circulate, in the belief that it would alleviate terrorist pressure since it eschewed direct political action, especially assassination, and postponed revolution until after industrialization had proceeded far enough to create a fully developed bourgeois class and a fully developed proletariat. To be sure, the theory created by Marx's mid-19th century Germanic background was, as we shall see, gradually changed by the age-long Russian outlook, at first by the Leninist Bolshevik triumph over the Mensheviks and later by Stalin's Russian nationalist victory over Lenin's more Western rationalism. But in the period 1890 to 1914 the stalemate of a post-violence was broken, and progress, punctuated by violence and intolerance, appeared. This period of progress punctuated by violence which lasted from 1890 to 1914 has a number of aspects. Of these, the economic and social development will be discussed first, followed by the political and, lastly, the ideological. As late as the liberation of the serfs in 1863, Russia was practically untouched by the industrial process, and was indeed more backward by far than Britain and France had been before the invention of the steam engine itself. Owing to lack of roads, transportation was very poor except for the excellent system of rivers, and these were frozen for months each year. Mud tracks, impassable for part of the year and only barely passable for the rest of the time, left villages relatively isolated, with the result that almost all handicraft products and much agricultural produce were locally produced and locally consumed. The serfs were impoverished after liberation, and held at a low standard of living by having a large part of their produce taken from them as rents to landlords and as taxes to the state bureaucracy. This served to drain a considerable fraction of the country's agricultural and mineral production to the cities and to the export market. This fraction provided capital for the growth of a modern economy after 1863, being exported to pay for the import of the necessary machinery and industrial raw materials. This was supplemented by the direct importation of capital from abroad, especially from Belgium and France, while much capital, especially for railroads, was provided by the government. Foreign capital amounted to about one-third of all industrial capital in 1890 and rose to almost one-half by 1900. The proportions varied from one activity to another, the foreign portion being, in 1900, at 70% in the field of mining, 42% in the field of metallurgical industry, but less than low percent in textiles. At the same date, the entire capital of the railroads amounted to 4,700 million rubles, of which 3,500 belonged to the government. These two sources were of very great importance because, except in textiles, most industrial development was based on the railroads, and the earliest enterprises in heavy industry, apart from the old charcoal metallurgy of the Ural Mountains, were foreign. The first great railroad concession, that of the main company for 2,650 miles of line, was given to a French company in 1857. The British corporation opened the exploitation of the Great Southern Iron Ore Basin at Krivoy Rog, while the German Nobel brothers began the development of the petroleum industry at Baku both about 1880. As a consequence of these factors, the Russian economy remained largely, but decreasingly, a colonial economy for most of the period 1863 to 1914. There was a very low standard of living for the Russian people, with excessive exportation of consumers' commodities, even those badly needed by the Russian people themselves, these being used to obtain foreign exchange to buy industrial or luxury commodities of foreign origin to be owned by the very small ruling class. This pattern of Russian economic organization has continued under the Soviet regime since 1917. The first Russian railroad opened in 1838, but growth was slow until the establishment of a rational plan of development in 1857. This plan sought to penetrate the chief agricultural regions, especially the Black Earth region of the South, in order to connect them with the chief cities of the North and the export ports. At that time there were only 663 miles of railroads, but this figure went up over tenfold by 1871, doubled again by 1881 with 14,000 miles reached 37,000 by 1901, and 46,600 by 1915. This building took place in two great waves, the first in the decade 18,661,875 and the second in the 15 years 1891 to 1905. In these two periods averages of over 1,400 miles of track were constructed annually, while in the intervening 15 years, from 1876 to 1890, the average construction was only 63 miles per year. The decrease in this middle period resulted from the Great Depression in Western Europe in 1873 to 1893, and culminated, in Russia, in the terrible famine of 1891. After this last date, railroad construction was pushed vigorously by Count Sergei Witte, who advanced from station master to Minister of Finance, holding the latter post from 1892 to 1903. His greatest achievement was the single-tracked Trans-Siberian line, which ran 6,365 miles from the Polish frontier to Vladivostok and was built in the 14 years 1891 to 1905. This line, by permitting Russia to increase her political pressure in the Far East, brought Britain into an alliance with Japan in 1902 and brought Russia into war with Japan in 1904 to 1905. The railroads had a most profound effect on Russia from every point of view, binding 1/6 of the Earth's surface into a single political unit and transforming that country's economic, political, and social life. New areas, chiefly in the steppes, which had previously been too far from markets to be used for any purpose but pastoral activities, were brought under cultivation chiefly for grains and cotton, thus competing with the central black soil areas. The drain of wealth from the peasants to the urban and export markets was increased, especially in the period before 1890. This process was assisted by the advent of a money economy to those rural areas which had previously been closer to a self-sufficient or a barter basis. This increased agricultural specialization and weakened handicraft activities. The collection of rural products, which had previously been in the hands of a few large commercial operators who worked slowly on a long-term basis, largely through Russia's more than 6,000 annual fairs, WR, after 1870, thanks to the railroad replaced a horde of small, quick-turnover middlemen, who swarmed like ants through the countryside, offering the contents of their small pouches of money for grain, hemp, hides, fats, bristles, and feathers. This drain of goods from the rural areas was encouraged by the government through quotas and restrictions, price differentials and different railroad rates and taxes for the same commodities with different destinations. As a result, Russian sugar sold in London for about 40% of its price in Russia itself. Russia, with a domestic consumption of 10.5 pounds of sugar per capita compared to England's 92 pounds per capita, nevertheless exported in 1900 a quarter of its total production of 1,802 million pounds. In the same year Russia exported almost 12 million pounds of cotton goods chiefly to Persia and China, although domestic consumption of cotton in Russia was only 5.3 pounds per capita compared to England's 39 pounds. In petroleum products, where Russia had 48% of the total world production in 1900, about 13.3% was exported, although Russian consumption was only 12 pounds per capita each year compared to Germany's 42 pounds. In one of these products, kerosene, where Russia had the strongest potential domestic demand, almost 60% of the domestic production was exported. The full extent of this drain of wealth from the rural areas can be judged from the export figures in general. In 1891 to 1895 rural products formed 75% and cereals 40% of the total value of all Russian exports. Moreover, it was the better grains which were exported, a quarter of the wheat crop compared to 1/15 of the crop in 1900. That there was a certain improvement in this respect, as time passed, can be seen from the fact that the portion of the wheat crop exported fell from half in the 1800s to 1/6 in 1912 to 1913. This policy of siphoning wealth into the export market gave Russia a favorable balance of trade, that is, excess of exports over imports for the whole period after 1875, providing gold and foreign exchange which allowed the country to build up its gold reserve and to provide capital for its industrial development. In addition, billions of rubles were obtained by sales of bonds of the Russian government, largely in France as part of the French effort to build up the Triple Entente. The State Bank, which had increased its gold reserve from 475 million to 1095 million rubles in the period 1890-1897, was made the Bank of Issue in 1897 and was required by law to redeem its notes in gold, thus placing Russia on the international gold standard. The number of corporations in Russia increased from 504 with 912 million rubles capital, of which 215 million was foreign in 1889, to 1,181 corporations with 1,737 million rubles capital, of which over 800 million was foreign in 1899. The proportion of industrial concerns among these corporations steadily increased, being 58% of the new capital flotations in 1874, 1881 as compared to only 11% in 1861 to 1873. Much of the impetus to industrial advance came from the railroads, since these, in the last decade of the 19th century, were by far chief purchasers of ferrous metals, coal, and petroleum products. As a result, there was a spectacular outburst of economic productivity in this decade, followed by a decade of lower prosperity after 1900. The production of pig iron in the period 1860 to 1870 ranged about 350,000 tons a year, rose to 997,000 tons in 1890, to almost 1.6 million tons in 1895, and reached a peak of 3.3 million tons in 1900. During this period, iron production shifted from the charcoal foundries of the Urals to the modern coke furnaces of the Ukraine, the percentages of the total Russian production being 67% from the Urals to 6% from the south in 1870 and 20% from the Urals with 67% from the south in 1913. The production figure for 1900 was not exceeded during the next decade, but rose after 1909 to reach 4.6 million tons in 1913. This compared with 14.4 million tons in Germany, 31.5 million in the United States, or almost 9 million in the United Kingdom. Coal production presents a somewhat similar picture, except that its growth continued through the decade 1900 to 1910. Production rose from 750,000 tons in 1870 to over 3.6 million tons in 1880 and reached almost 7 million in 1890 and almost 17.5 million in 1900. From this point, coal production, unlike pig iron, continued upward to 26.2 million tons in 1908 and to 36 million in 1913. This last figure compares to Germany's production of 190 million tons, American production of 517 million tons, and British production of 287 million tons in that same year of 1913. In coal, as in pig iron, there was a geographic shift of the center of production, one-third of the Russian coal coming from the Donetsk area in 1860, while more than two-thirds came from that area in 1900 and 70% in 1913. In petroleum there was a somewhat similar geographic shift in the center of production, Baku having better than go % of the total in every year from 1870 until after 1900, when the new Grozny fields and a steady decline in Baku's output reduced the latter's percentage to 85 in 1910 and to 83 in 1913. Because of this decline in Baku's output, Russian production of petroleum, which soared until 1901, declined after that year. Production was only 35,000 tons in 1870, rose to 600,000 tons in 1880, then leaped to 4.8 million tons in 1890, to 11.3 million in 1900, and reached its peak of over 12 million tons in the following year. For the next 12 years output hovered somewhat below 8.4 million tons. Because the industrialization of Russia came so late, it was except in textiles on a large-scale basis from the beginning, and was organized on a basis of financial capitalism after 1870 and of monopoly capitalism after 1902. Although factories employing over 500 workers amounted to only 3% of all factories in the 1890s, 4% in 1903, and 5% in 1910. These factories generally employed over half of all factory workers. This was a far higher percentage than in Germany or the United States, and made it easier for labor agitators to organize the workers in these Russian factories. Moreover, although Russia as a whole was not highly industrialized and output per worker or per unit for Russia as a whole was low because of the continued existence of older forms of production, the new Russian factories were built with the most advanced technological equipment, sometimes to a degree which the untrained labor supply could not utilize. In 1912 the output of pig iron per furnace in the Ukraine was higher than in Western Europe by a large margin, although smaller than in the United States by an equally large margin. Although the quantity of mechanical power available on a per capita basis for the average Russian was low in 1908 compared to Western Europe, for America being only 1.6 horsepower per 100 persons in Russia compared to 25 in the United States, 24 in England, and 13 in Germany, the horsepower per industrial worker was higher in Russia than in any other continental country, being 92 horsepower per 100 workers in Russia compared to 85 in France, 73 in Germany, 153 in England, and 282 in the United States. All this made the Russian economy an economy of contradictions. Though the range of technical methods was very wide, advanced techniques were lacking completely in some fields, and even whole fields of necessary industrial activities such as machine tools or automobiles were lacking. The economy was poorly integrated, was extremely dependent on foreign trade both for markets and for essential products, and was very dependent on government assistance, especially on government spending, while the great mass of the Russian people continued, as late as 1914, to live much as they had lived for generations. A small number lived in a new, and very insecure, world of industrialism, where they were at the mercy of foreign or governmental forces over which they had little control. The managers of this new world sought to improve their positions, not by any effort to create a mass market in the other, more primitive, Russian economic world, by improved methods of distribution, by reduction of prices, or by rising standards of living, but rather sought to increase their own profit margins on a narrow market by ruthless reduction of costs, especially wages, and by monopolistic combinations to raise prices. These efforts led to labor agitation on one hand and to monopolistic capitalism on the other. Economic progress, except in some lines, was slowed up for these reasons during the whole decade 1900 to 1909. Only in 1909, when a largely monopolistic structure of industry had been created, was the increase in output of goods resumed and the struggle with labor somewhat abated. The earliest Russian cartels were formed with the encouragement of the Russian government and in those activities where foreign interests were most prevalent. In 1887 the sugar cartel was formed in order to permit foreign dumping of this commodity. A similar agency was set up for kerosene in 1892, but the great period of formation of such organizations, usually in the form of joint selling agencies, began after the crisis of 1901. In 1902 a cartel created by a dozen iron and steel firms handled almost 3/4 of all Russian sales of these products. It was controlled by 4 foreign banking groups. A similar cartel, ruled from Berlin, took over the sales of almost all Russian production of iron pipe. 6 Ukraine iron ore firms in 1908 set up a cartel controlling 80% of Russia's ore production. In 1907 a cartel was created to control about 3/4 of Russia's agricultural implements. Others handled 97% of railway cars, 94% of locomotives, and 94% of copper sales. 18 units coal firms in 1906 set up a cartel which sold 3/4 of the coal output of that area. The creation of monopoly was aided by a change in tariff policy. Free trade, which had been established in the tariff of 1857, was curtailed in 1877 and abandoned in 1891. The protective tariff of this latter year resulted in a severe tariff war with Germany, as the Germans sought to exclude Russian agricultural products in retaliation for the Russian tariff on manufactured goods. This war was settled in 1894 by a series of compromises, but the reopening of the German market to Russian grain led to political agitation for protection on the part of German landlords. They were successful, as we shall see. in 1900 as a result of a deal with the German industrialists to support Tirpitz's naval building program. On the eve of the First World War, the Russian economy was in a very dubious state of health. As we have said, it was a patchwork affair, very much lacking in integration, very dependent on foreign and government support, racked by labor disturbances, and, what was even more threatening, by labor disturbances based on political rather than on economic motives, and shot through with all kinds of technological weaknesses and discords. As an example of the last, we might mention the fact that over half of Russia's pig iron was made with charcoal as late as 1900, and some of Russia's most promising natural resources were left unused as a result of the restrictive outlook of monopoly capitalists. The failure to develop a domestic market left costs of distribution fantastically high and left the Russian per capita consumption of almost all important commodities fantastically low. Moreover, to make matters worse, Russia as a consequence of these things was losing ground in the race of production with France, Germany, and the United States. These economic developments had profound political effects under the weak-willed Tsar Nicholas II (1894–1917). For about a decade Nicholas tried to combine ruthless civil repression, economic advance, and an imperialist foreign policy in the Balkans and the Far East, with pious worldwide publicity for peace and universal disarmament, domestic distractions like anti-Semitic massacres, pogroms, forged terroristic documents, and faked terroristic attempts on the lives of high officials, including himself. This unlikely melange collapsed completely in 1905–1908, when Count Witt attempted to begin some kind of constitutional development by getting in touch with the functioning units of local government, the Zemstvos, which had been effective in the famine of 1891. He was ousted from his position by an intrigue led by the murderous Minister of Interior Vyacheslav Pliway. 1903. The civil head of the Orthodox Church, Konstantin Pobedunov (1827–1907), persecuted all dissenting religions, while allowing the Orthodox Church to become enveloped in ignorance and corruption. Most Roman Catholic monasteries in Poland were confiscated, while priests of that religion were forbidden to leave their villages. In Finland, construction of Lutheran churches was forbidden, and schools of this religion were taken over by the Moscow government. The Jews were persecuted, restricted to certain provinces. The Pale excluded from most economic activities, subjected to heavy taxes even on their religious activities, and allowed to form only 10% of the pupils in schools, even in villages which were almost completely Jewish and where the schools were supported entirely by Jewish taxes. Hundreds of Jews were massacred and thousands of their buildings wrecked in systematic three-day pogroms tolerated and sometimes encouraged by the police. Marriages and children of Roman Catholic uniates were made illegitimate. The Muslims in Asia and elsewhere were also persecuted. Every effort was made to Russify non-Russian national groups, especially on the western frontiers. The Finns, Baltic Germans, and Poles were not allowed to use their own languages in public life, and had to use Russian even in private schools and even on the primary level. Administrative autonomy in these areas, even that solemnly promised to Finland long before, was destroyed, and they were dominated by Russian police, Russian education, and the Russian army. The peoples of these areas were subjected to military conscription more rigorously than the Russians themselves, and were Russified while in the ranks. Against the Russians themselves, unbelievable extremes of espionage, counter-espionage, censorship, provocation, imprisonment without trial, and outright brutality were employed. The revolutionaries responded with similar measures crowned by assassination. No one could trust anyone else, because revolutionaries were in the police, and members of the police were in the highest ranks of the revolutionaries. Georgy Gapin, a priest secretly in the pay of the government, was encouraged to form labor unions and lead workers' agitations in order to increase the employers' dependence on the autocracy. But when, in 1905, Gapin led a mass march of workers to the Winter Palace to present the petition to the Tsar, they were attacked by the troops and hundreds were shot. Gapin was murdered the following year by the revolutionaries as a traitor. In order to discredit the revolutionaries, the Central Police Department in St. Petersburg printed at the government expense violent appeals to riot, which were circulated all over the country by an organization of reactionaries. In 1 year 1906 the government exiled 35,000 persons without trial and executed over 600 persons under a new decree which fixed the death penalty for ordinary crimes like robbery or insults to officials. In the 3 years 1906 to 1908, 5,140 officials were killed or wounded, and 2,328 arrested persons were executed. In 1909 it was revealed that a police agent, Joseph, had been a member of the Central Committee of the Socialist Revolutionaries for years and had participated in plots to murder high officials, including Pliway and the Grand Duke Sergius, without warning these. The former chief of police who revealed this fact was sent to prison for doing so. Under conditions such as these no sensible government was possible and all appeals for moderation were crushed between the extremists from both sides. The defeats of Russian forces in the war with Japan in 1904 to 1905 brought events to a head. All dissatisfied groups began to agitate, culminating in a successful general strike in October 1905. The emperor began to offer political reforms, although what was extended one day was frequently taken back shortly after. A consultative assembly, the Duma, was established, elected on a broad suffrage but by very complicated procedures designed to reduce the democratic element. In the face of agrarian atrocities, endless strikes, and mutinies in both the army and navy, the censorship was temporarily lifted, and the First Duma met May 1906. It had a number of able men and was dominated by two hastily organized political parties: the Cadets somewhat left of center and the Octobers somewhat right of center. Plans for wholesale reform were in the and when the Tsar's chief minister rejected such plans, he was overwhelmingly censured by the Duma. After weeks of agitation, the Tsar tried to form an Octoberist ministry, but this group refused to govern without cadet cooperation, and the latter refused to join the coalition government. The Tsar named Petr Stolypin chief minister, dissolved the first Duma, and called for election of a new one. Stolypin was a severe man, willing to move slowly in the direction of economic and political reform but determined to crush without mercy any suspicion of violence or illegal actions. The full power of the government was used to get a second Duma more to its taste, outlawing most of the cadets, previously the largest party, and preventing certain classes and groups from campaigning or voting. The result was a new Duma of much less ability, much less discipline, and with many unknown faces. The cadets were reduced from 150 to 123, the Octoberists from about 42 to 32, while there were 46 extreme right, 54 Marxist Social Democrats, 35 Social Revolutionaries, at least 100 assorted laborites, and scattered others. This group devoted much of its time to debating whether terrorist violence should be condemned. Stolypin demanded that the Social Democrats Marxists should be kicked out. The Duma referred the matter to a committee. The assembly was immediately dissolved, and new elections were fixed for a third Duma June 1908. Under powerful government intimidation, which included sending 3 Social Democrats to Siberia, the third Duma was elected. It was mostly an upper-class and upper-middle-class body, with the largest groups being 150 for Octoberists and 50 for cadets. This body was sufficiently docile to remain for 5 years, 1907 to 1912. During this period both the Duma and the government followed a policy of drift, except for Stolypin. Until 1910 this energetic administrator continued his efforts to combine oppression and reform, especially agrarian reform. Rural credit banks were established. Various measures were taken to place larger amounts of land in the hands of peasants. Restrictions on the migration of peasants, especially to Siberia, were removed. Participation in local government was opened to lower social classes previously excluded. Education, especially technical education, was made more accessible, and certain provisions for social insurance were enacted into law. After the Bosnian crisis of 1908, to be discussed later, foreign affairs became increasingly absorbing, and by 1910 Stolypin had lost his enthusiasm for reform, replacing it by senseless efforts at Russification of the numerous minority groups. He was assassinated in the presence of the Tsar in 1911. The Fourth Duma 1912 to 1916 was similar to the Third, elected by complicated procedures and on the restricted suffrage. The policy of drift continued, and what's more obvious, since no energetic figure like Stolypin was to be found. On the contrary, the autocracy sank deeper into a morass of superstition and corruption. The influence of the Tsarina became more pervasive, and through her was extended the power of a number of religious mystics and charlatans, especially Rasputin. The imperial couple had ardently desired a son from their marriage in 1894. After the birth of 4 daughters, their wish was fulfilled in 1904. Unfortunately, the new Tsar Alexis had inherited from his mother an incurable disease, hemophilia. Since his blood would not clot, the slightest cut endangered his life. This weakness merely exaggerated the Tsarina's fanatical devotion to her son and her determination to see him become Tsar with the powers of that office undiminished by any constitutional or parliamentary innovations. After 1907 she fell under the influence of a strange wanderer, Rasputin, a man whose personal habits and appearance were both vicious and filthy, but who had the power, she believed, to stop the Tsarev's bleeding. The Tsarina fell completely under Rasputin's control, and, since the Tsar was completely under her control, Rasputin became the ruler of Russia, intermittently at first, but then completely. This situation lasted until he was murdered in December 1916. Rasputin used his power to satisfy his personal vices, to accumulate wealth by corruption, and to interfere in every branch of the government, always in a destructive and unprogressive sense. As Sir Bernard Pears put it, speaking of the Tsarina, her letters to Nicholas day by day contain the instructions which Rasputin gave on every detail of administration of the empire, the church, the ministers, finance, railways, food supply, appointments, military operations, and above all the Duma, and a simple comparison of the dates with the events which followed shows that in almost every case they were carried out. In all her recommendations for ministerial posts, most of which are adopted, one of the primary considerations is always the attitude of the given candidate to Rasputin. As the autocracy became increasingly corrupt and irresponsible in this way, the slow growth toward a constitutional system which might have developed from the Zemstvo system of local government and the able membership of the First Duma was destroyed. The resumption of economic expansion after 1909 could not counterbalance the pernicious influence of the political paralysis. This situation was made even more hopeless by the growing importance of foreign affairs after 1908 and the failure of intellectual life to grow in any constructive fashion. The first of these complications will be discussed later. The second deserves a few words here. The general trend of intellectual development in Russia in the years before 1914 could hardly be regarded as hopeful. To be sure, there were considerable advances in some fields such as literacy, natural science, mathematics, and economic thought, but these contributed little to any growth of moderation or to Russia's greatest intellectual need, the more integrated outlook on life. The influence of the old orthodox religious attitude continued even in those who most emphatically rejected it. The basic attitude of the Western tradition had grown toward diversity and toleration, based on the belief that every aspect of life and of human experience and every individual has some place in the complex structure of reality if that place can only be found, and that, accordingly, unity of the whole of life can be reached by way of diversity rather than by any compulsory uniformity. This idea was entirely foreign to the Russian mind. Any Russian thinker, and hordes of other Russians with no capacity for thought, were driven by an insatiable thirst to find the key to life and to truth. Once this key has been found, all other aspects of human experience must be rejected as evil, and all men must be compelled to accept the key as the whole of life in a dreadful unity of uniformity. To make matters worse, many Russian thinkers sought to analyze the complexities of human experience by polarizing these into antitheses of mutually exclusive dualisms: Westerners versus Slavophiles, individualism versus community, freedom versus fate, revolutionary versus reactionary, nature versus conventions, autocracy versus anarchy, and such. There was no logical correlation between these, so that individual thinkers frequently embraced either side of any antithesis, forming an incredible mixture of emotionally held faiths. Moreover, individual thinkers frequently shifted from one side to another, or even oscillated back and forth between the extremes of these dualisms. In the most typical Russian minds, both extremes were held simultaneously, regardless of logical compatibility, in some kind of higher mystic unity beyond rational analysis. Thus, Russian thought provides us with striking examples of God-intoxicated atheists, revolutionary reactionaries, violent non-resistors, belligerent pacifists, compulsory liberators, and individualistic totalitarians. The basic characteristic of Russian thought is its extremism. This took two forms: one, any portion of human experience to which allegiance was given became the whole truth, demanding total allegiance, all else being evil deception; and two, every living person was expected to accept this same portion or be damned as a minion of Antichrist. Those who embraced the state were expected to embrace it as an autocracy in which the individual had no rights, else their allegiance was not pure. Those who denied the state were expected to reject it utterly by adopting anarchism. Those who became materialists had to become complete nihilists without place for any convention, ceremony, or sentiment. Those who questioned some minor aspect of the religious system were expected to become militant atheists, and if they did not take this step themselves, were driven to it by the clergy. Those who were considered to be spiritual or said they were spiritual were forgiven every kind of corruption and lechery like Rasputin because such material aspects were irrelevant. Those who sympathized with the oppressed were expected to bury themselves in the masses, living like them, eating like them, dressing like them, and renouncing all culture and thought if they believed the masses lacked these things. The extremism of Russian thinkers can be seen in their attitudes toward such basic aspects of human experience as property, reason, the state, art, sex, or power. Always there was a fanatical tendency to eliminate as sinful and evil anything except the one aspect which the thinker considered to be the key to the cosmos. Alexei Kolyakov (1804–1860), a Slavophile, wanted to reject reason completely, regarding it as the mortal sin of the West, while Fyodor Dostoevsky (1821–1881) went so far in this direction that he wished to destroy all logic and all arithmetic, seeking, he said, to free humanity from the tyranny of 2 plus 2 equals 4. Many Russian thinkers, long before the Soviets, regarded all property as sinful. Others felt the same way about sex. Leo Tolstoy, the great novelist and essayist (1828–1910), considered all property and all sex to be evil. Western thought, which has usually tried to find a place in the cosmos for everything and has felt that anything is acceptable in its proper place, recoils from such fanaticism. The West, for example, has rarely felt it necessary to justify the existence of art, but many thinkers in Russia like Plato long ago have rejected all art as evil. Tolstoy, among others, had moments as in the essay What is Art? Of 1897 or on Shakespeare and the Drama of 1903, when he denounced most art and literature, including his own novels, as vain, irrelevant, and satanic. Similarly, the West, while it has sometimes looked askance at sex and more frequently has overemphasized it, has generally felt that sex had a proper function in its proper place. In Russia, however, many thinkers, including once again Tolstoy, the Kreutzer Sonata of 1889, have insisted that sex was evil in all places and under all circumstances, and most sinful in marriage. The disruptive effects of such ideas upon social or family life can be seen in the later years of Tolstoy's personal life, culminating in his last final hatred of his long-suffering wife, whom he came to regard as the instrument of his fall from grace. But while Tolstoy praised marriage without sex, other Russians, with even greater vehemence, praised sex without marriage, regarding this social institution as an unnecessary impediment in the path of pure human impulse. In some ways we find in Tolstoy the culmination of Russian thought. He rejected all power, all violence, most art, all sex, all public authority, and all property as evil. To him the key of the universe was to be found in Christ's injunction: resist not evil. All other aspects of Christ's teachings except those which flow directly from this were rejected, including any belief in Christ's divinity or in a personal God. From this injunction flowed Tolstoy's ideas of non-violence and non-resistance, and his faith that only in this way could man's capacity for a spiritual love so powerful that it could solve all social problems he liberated. This idea of Tolstoy, although based on Christ's injunction, is not so much a reflection of Christianity as it is of the basic Russian assumption that any physical defeat must represent a spiritual victory, and that the latter could be achieved only through the former. Such a point of view could be held only by persons to whom all prosperity or happiness is not only irrelevant but sinful. And this point of view could be held with such fanaticism only by persons to whom life, family, or any objective gain is worthless. This is a dominant idea in all the Russian intelligentsia, an idea going back through Plato to ancient Asia. All objective reality is of no importance except as symbols for some subjective truth. This was, of course, the point of view of the Neoplatonic thinkers of the early Christian period. It was generally the point of view of the early Christian heretics and of those Western heretics like the Caffari Albigenses who were derived from this Eastern philosophic position. In modern Russian thought it is well represented by Dostoevsky, who while chronologically earlier than Tolstoy is spiritually later. To Dostoevsky every object and every act is merely a symbol for some elusive spiritual truth. From this point of view comes an outlook which makes his characters almost incomprehensible to the average person in the Western tradition. If such a character obtains a fortune, he cries, "I am ruined." If he is acquitted on a murder charge, or seems likely to be, he exclaims, "I am condemned," and seeks to incriminate himself in order to ensure the punishment which is so necessary for his own spiritual self-acquittal. If he deliberately misses his opponent in a duel, he has a guilty conscience, and says, "I should not have injured him thus. I should have killed him." In each case the speaker cares nothing about property, punishment, or life. He cares only about spiritual values, asceticism, guilt, remorse, injury to one's self-respect. In the same way, the early religious thinkers, both Christian and non-Christian, regarded all objects as symbols for spiritual values, all temporal success as an inhibition on spiritual life, and felt that wealth could be obtained only by getting rid of property. Life could be found only by dying. A direct quotation from Plato: "Eternity could be found only if time ended, and the soul could be freed only if the body were enslaved." Thus, as late as 1910 when Tolstoy died, Russia remained true to its Greek-Byzantine intellectual tradition. We have noted that Dostoevsky, who lived slightly before Tolstoy, nevertheless had ideas which were chronologically in advance of Tolstoy's ideas. In fact, in many ways, Dostoevsky was a precursor of the Bolsheviks. Concentrating his attention on poverty, crime, and human misery, always seeking the real meaning behind every overt act or word, he eventually reached a position where the distinction between appearance and significance became so wide that these two were in contradiction with each other. This contradiction was really the struggle between God and the devil in the soul of man. Since this struggle is without end, there is no solution to man's problems except to face suffering resolutely. Such suffering purges men of all artificiality and joins them together in one mass. In this mass, the Russian people, because of their greater suffering and their greater spirituality, are the hope of the world and must save the world from the materialism, violence, and selfishness of Western civilization. The Russian people, on the other hand, filled with self-sacrifice, and with no allegiance to luxury or material gain, and purified by suffering which makes them the brothers of all other suffering people, will save the world by taking up the sword of righteousness against the forces of evil stemming from Europe. Constantinople will be seized, all the Slavs will be liberated, and Europe and the world will be forced into freedom by conquest, so that Moscow may become the third Rome. Before Russia is fit to save the world in this way, however, the Russian intellectuals must merge themselves in the great mass of the suffering Russian people, and the Russian people must adopt Europe's science and technology uncontaminated by any European ideology. The blood spilled in this effort to extend Slav brotherhood to the whole world by force will aid the cause, for suffering shared will make men one. This mystical Slav imperialism with its apocalyptical overtones was by no means uniquely Dostoevsky's. It was held in a vague and implicit fashion by many Russian thinkers, and had a wide appeal to the unthinking masses. It was implied in much of the propaganda of pan-Slavism, and became semi-official with the growth of this propaganda after 1908. It was widespread among the Orthodox clergy, who emphasized the reign of righteousness which would follow the millennialist establishment of Moscow as the Third Rome. It was explicitly stated in a book, Russia and Europe, published in 1869 by Nicholas Danilevsky 1822–1885. Such ideas, as we shall see, did not die out with the passing of the Romanov autocracy in 1917, but became even more influential, merging with the Leninist revision of Marxism to provide the ideology of Soviet Russia after 1917.